Canada was going to have to put in place extraordinary measures to get through this pandemic. We did something that I don't think a country in history has ever done. And our peers, the wealthy industrialized nations around the world, did the same thing. We literally shut down the economy. With hindsight, I am very confident we did the right thing.
People will say, well, Canada's lockdown approach was successful because we've got high vaccination rates and Canadians were compliant. Well, that's a pretty narrow lens. I mean, you have to look at how many Canadians have been killed because their cancer screening was canceled because, chief medical officer said, oh, we're shutting down all the hospitals. How many people have died because when they finally did get their diagnosis, they now had 4th stage cancer and it was no longer possible to treat. That's what's missing from the government's perspective. They're just not looking at any of the harms.
Tamara Ugolini here with Rebel News to bring you a summary of the report compiled by the Justice Centre for Constitutional Freedoms, that's the JCCF, on all-cause mortality across Canada. I began reporting on this concerning trend in all-cause mortality increases in April with data analyst Kelly Brown, who found an alarming increase to the all-cause mortality for age groups who were not at all at risk of severe COVID infection and outcomes. This is further confirmed by the report published by the JCCF, which is a Canadian organization and federally registered charity that vigorously defends and fights to preserve the constitutional freedoms of Canadians through legal representation and education. Joining me now to discuss their 21-page report titled Excess Deaths Contradict Narrative of Success is President and founder of the JCCF, John Carpay.
So first and foremost, why did you set out to compile this report?
Well, we've got a government narrative that has been embraced by many media elites and many sectors of the medical establishment. And this narrative is that lockdowns were hugely successful in Canada. And this conclusion is not strongly supported when the health authorities, when the politicians, when the government-funded media fail to look at the negative impacts, the harms of lockdowns, which, by the way, their governments are required under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. When governments violate our freedoms to move, to travel, to assemble, to associate, to worship, which they have, when those rights and freedoms are trampled on, the government has the responsibility of evaluating both the benefits, if any, and the harms, if any, of their policies, and governments haven't done this. So one of the reasons for releasing this report is just part of holding governments accountable. You cannot just say that lockdowns were great and wonderful and then not even look at the harm that they caused.
Right. And we saw that clip of Chrystia Freeland, basically stating that the lockdowns and these policies prevented X amount of deaths.
Canada was going to have to put in place extraordinary measures to get through this pandemic. We did something that I don't think a country in history has ever done. And our peers, the wealthy industrialized nations around the world, did the same thing. We literally shut down the economy. With hindsight, I am very confident we did the right thing. And there was actually a study over the summer led by David Naylor and a couple of other academics. They found that if Canada had had the mortality rate of the United States, 70,000 additional Canadians would have died. That's more than the population of Fredericton. So I think all Canadians, it was very hard those 2 years, but I think we should all remember that that saved at least 70,000 lives.
Which data did you source here? And then obviously, what did you find in that regard?
Statistics Canada says that there were 8,000 excess deaths in the last half of 2021. An excess death is an unexpected death. So you have the actuaries and the accountants who look at the death statistics and how many people are dying, why are they dying, how old are they when they die. And looking at all these statistics, they can predict with reasonable accuracy how many people are normally expected to die during a particular time period or in a particular province. So excess deaths are where it's off the charts, where it's like, well, wait a minute, we got like 8,000 people who died unexpectedly. And so what our report highlights is that this is caused by the delayed surgeries, canceled surgeries, canceled cancer screenings, canceled diagnostic procedures, and a huge increase in the number of people dying from drug overdoses.
Right. And now you contrasted that with how the government has defined pandemic success. Can you lend a little bit of information into how the government has defined this success via these policies and lockdowns and mandates versus what your report has highlighted as otherwise?
People who say that Canada's response to COVID has been successful, they're just looking only at vaccination rates and the degree of compliance with the health orders. So they would look at Canadians and say, well, we had, whatever, 85%, 90%. We had a very high rate of people getting at least one shot, still a very high rate of people getting 2 shots. Canadians were, for the most part, compliant and obedient during lockdowns, and they, made sure that they didn't spend Christmas dinner with their parents or with their kids. And so people will say, well, Canada's lockdown approach was successful because we've got high vaccination rates and Canadians were compliant. Well, that's a pretty narrow lens. I mean, you have to look at how many Canadians have been killed because their cancer screening was canceled because, chief medical officer said, oh, we're shutting down all the hospitals. How many people have died because when they finally did get their diagnosis, they now had 4th stage cancer and it was no longer possible to treat? That's what's missing from the government's perspective. They're just not looking at any of the harms.
What will it take to get them to start looking at that harm and acknowledge that there was some handlings here that, were not evidence-based and, obviously potentially had this massive fallout of harm?
It's just going to take slow, persistent, continuous effort on the part of Canadian citizens to keep on raising the issue politely, repeatedly. Do not give up and quit. It's the same concept of how dripping water can wear away a rock, right? And can make a stone smooth just because if you have this little water drip, if it goes on long enough. People go mad in crowds, but they regain their sanity individually, bit by bit by bit. And so Canadians were put into a state of panic in March of 2020 by the demonstrably false claims of Dr. Neil Ferguson at Imperial College, who said that COVID would be like the Spanish flu of 1918, that it would kill tens of millions of people, that it would kill more than 300,000 Canadians. And people got put into the state of fear. But what's happening now is bit by bit, people are kind of regaining their sanity and moving out of fear. And so what we need to do is just keep on telling politicians, well, what about the harms? What about the harms? What about the harms? And just keep on politely pushing that point. And I think it's going to be a long-term game to persuade politicians to accept responsibility for, looking at harms as well as benefits.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. They would have to admit fault. And so we've seen that is not top priority for any politician at this juncture. Just to play devil's advocate a little bit, there's that idea or the thought that correlation doesn't equal causation. What would you say to someone who came to you and said, this report is, there's causality, but just because something correlates doesn't necessarily mean one causes the other? What would you say to someone that came with that?
Well, let's start by applying that principle to all of the claims of, people dying of COVID that we've heard at, hundreds and hundreds of news conferences of the federal health officials, provincial health officials in each province saying, well, in this past week, there were 20 people who died of COVID. Well, correlation and causation are not the same, because whenever 20 people have died of COVID, you're looking at 17 or 18 of them are people that have one or more serious health conditions, people that are elderly, people that are in nursing homes. And to suggest that everybody's going to live forever is misleading. So what we have here with the excess death statistics, this is actuarial science. I mean, the life insurance companies use this data to determine how big the premiums are that we need to pay for life insurance, how big the payouts are, how do they get dividends for shareholders. So this actuarial science, Statistics Canada itself says we've got 8,000 excess deaths. So our report also includes the Canadian Medical Association and a Deloitte report that they commissioned. And so the Canadian Medical Association has said over 4,000 deaths from canceled surgeries and canceled diagnostic proceedings. So that's that's one of the authorities that we refer to. Over 560,000 surgeries were canceled in the first 12 months of lockdowns.
Just grotesque. Now, in closing, not in closing, actually, sorry. One other thing that the report pointed out was that these excess deaths actually take place in demographics that were not otherwise at risk of, severe outcomes of COVID. Can you reconfirm that that's what your findings were there when you delved into these statistics, again, from the Canadian government directly?
Yeah, it's even more shocking that these excess deaths are occurring in Canadians under 45, a huge number of them. There are more people dying from the canceled surgeries and the delayed diagnostic procedures, and the drug overdoses have almost doubled. And these excess deaths are in the under 45 crowd, who are people who statistically are in very little danger of being harmed by COVID. So it's almost like a double whammy. We have more deaths, we have more excess deaths than the number of people that are dying of COVID. And these deaths are in the younger demographic, which means it's a huge impact on the population life expectancy.
And of course, this doesn't even begin to delve into the mental health fallout or the education crisis facing the children who've been locked out of their schools for the better part of a year and a half. There's still so much here that we have yet to garner in the data, the real world data as it unfolds in real time. Does JCCF have any plans to hold the government to account with this report in hand?
In all of the court actions that the Justice Centre commences in regards to vaccine passports, lockdowns, the Arrive Can app, quarantine restrictions, so on and so forth, we always have expert evidence put before the court, and we have medical doctors and other scientists who are the witnesses. So this report would be an example of the kind of data that we do put and we will continue to put before the courts. The government's going to, with time, be increasingly pinned down in court as more and more actions are brought, because the government has to answer questions and they cannot easily depart from statements that they've made previously. So I think the litigation is going to become more and more successful with time.
I hear a lot of people being quite nervous and concerned that lockdowns and mandates and these sorts of things are coming back to us now in the fall as we face again that seasonality with respiratory viruses. Would you say that there's too much evidence now to go back to that, or would you quash the concerns or the fears of everyday Canadians who think that these policies may be coming back?
It's a fair question. I don't think I'm very good at predicting the future, but I will say that definitely some politicians, they absolutely love the power trip of being able to tell people what to do, when to do it, where to go, how to live their lives. Some politicians love the power trip of lockdowns and being able to control so many aspects of the lives of people. Now, there's less and less medical and scientific basis for these violations of charter freedoms. So I don't know what's going to happen, but I will say that it's really important for the federal members of parliament and your provincial, your MPP, MLA, what have you, you've got to contact the politicians and say no more lockdowns, because they need to hear that from people. And I'm often surprised. I'm talking to people who are just, oh, these lockdowns have been so evil and so terrible these last 2.5 years. They've caused all this harm. And I say, well, have you talked to your provincial elected representative? Have you talked to your federal MP? And it's like, nope. It's like, okay, we're not going to see the change if people are not going to pick up the phone or send an email to their elected representatives.
As real-world data continues to be collected as to how this global experiment that began with an unprecedented full societal lockdown continues, I think it will paint the very grim and catastrophic picture that begs the question, knowing what we know now, would Canadians tolerate such knee-jerk reactions again? For Rebel News, I'm Tamara Ugolini. This alarming trend is exactly why vaccine mandates should be halted until more data and investigation into the increase in all-cause mortality can be thoroughly investigated. We've launched a campaign at noforcedboosters.com to put pressure on the institutions imposing these vaccine mandates to loosen their unscientific grip. All donations go directly to the Democracy Fund, which is a registered Canadian charity that we're crowdfunding for to help offset the cost of litigation on behalf of onboarded clients. Find out more, sign our petition, and chip in if you're able to at noforcedboosters.com.